Lately, in the 21st century, if you listen enough, you hear the topic of mental health in the black community be more and more prevalent because of how many African American youths are imprisoned on a daily basis, hospitalized due to substance abuse and violence, as well as the other mental damage that is taking its toll, especially on African American women and children. Not to mention the impact the pandemic has had on domestic violence. There's plenty of people who are completely ignorant to the generational detriment the African American community has suffered for centuries. My first point, individuals in the African American community are generally more prone to domestic trauma. 45% of black women experience contact, sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime, according to the National Center on Violence Against Women in the black community. This means that nearly half the African American women in our communities are being sexually and physically harassed or assaulted enormously, which can go further to explain the issue that many African American individuals suffer from, given that those same mental ailments from the women are passed down to their kids. 64% of single mothers in the United States are African American, which accounts for well over half the American matriarchal household population. The damage that is passed down from one generation to the next is what forms the unhealthy habits that take a toll on us as a people. Many black mothers have been verbally, sexually, and or physically abused, and so that caused them to develop defense mechanisms. As though defensive habits they picked up as children may be to close off people, including their close ones, responding in physical or verbal retaliation, or resorting to irresponsible behavior, such as stealing, promiscuity, or substance abuse. These behaviors are displayed to the ones closest to them, and almost always the ones closest to them are their children. Children tend to learn more by example than words, which leads to my next point. Blacks have been historically and culturally discouraged from getting mental therapy. There's a stigma that God will fix it all, your problems by his lonesome, and that's the only thing you need in order to get better mentally. This stereotype is derived from the fact that religion and faith in God is often the foundation in African American culture since the days of slavery. This is true, but most of us should know that not everybody who's in the church has a church in them. It's often made mandatory in African American homes for their children to attend church with their parents because of those same traditions passed down from the generation before them. Another large stigma that is universal is the one claiming that men don't cry. But this especially hits home for African American men who majority of their life have felt like their feelings shouldn't be expressed. The silent generation included people born in 1945 and before. Most of our grandparents were a part of that generation. This generation came after World War I, the Great Depression, and right at the time of Pearl Harbor. It's given its name because they don't speak on many of the events that took place throughout their early lives, and it caused a lot of mental and emotional damage witnessed by their kids, in many cases, who had to suffer in a sense as well. The Black American population suffered from this especially because of Jim Crow laws and all the racial backlash received as a whole. Despite the time not being at the extent of owning blacks or property of slavery, racial inequality was just as bad as it had ever been, mostly on behalf of the segregation of schools, business, church, sports, and extracurricular activities. Lastly, mental health in the black community is generally neglected. Whether it was physical, verbal, or sexual abuse, the need for help is not given very much attention, mainly because of the disregard for how serious the effects of those things are. The biggest victims are black children, because that's generally where the trauma starts and stays with them for the rest of their lives. The difference that can be made is talking about the emotional stress that one is given, that they will come out one way or another. Many make the mistake of sweeping under the rug, despite the true seriousness and urgency of the issue. Oprah is a prime example of a black woman that has had to deal with the sexual and verbal abuse in her own home and defy the odds of being a woman in those circumstances. But she made her very notorious living off of the importance, process, and promotion of mental health, usually in the young black men and women that appear on her show. OWN, or the Oprah Winfrey Network, is primarily centered around mental health in black couples, families, and businesses. There's so much that has affected the African American community over the years, from slavery to Jim Crow laws to deaths behind the big push in the Black Lives Matter movement. There's no shame in either asking for help nor offering it to those who seem like they're clearly in need of it. Mental health in the African American community has been fundamentally disregarded, but should be given national and even global attention because how prone blacks are to trauma within the home. The discouragement of mental aid in black communities and the mental neglect that blacks suffer from all over the world on a daily basis. This is by no means a knock to the mental health issues that is present in individuals from every race, but the lack of mental health has the African American community harder than any others, just from the course of time through slavery. Exploitation, drugs, rape, and abuse, unhealthy habits and behaviors have been generational and not hereditary, by the least. It starts with this generation making it a habit. It only gets better from there with consistency and the courage to say, I need help. Thank you.